Sometimes the hardest thing in this world is watching someone suffer and knowing you could help. In the winter of 1879, deep in Colorado territory, a young woman named Elise lay dying in the snow while an entire town looked the other way. They were too afraid, too worried about their own troubles to care about hers. But one man couldn't walk past her. Silas Ward was known as the Mountain Ghost, a man folks whispered about with equal parts fear and respect. He wrapped his fur cloak around her trembling body and spoke 4 simple words that changed both their lives. Forever, you're mine now. What he meant wasn't ownership, it was protection. But what made this hardened mountain man risk everything for a stranger left to freeze? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 days before, Silas Ward found that dying girl in the snow. He stood in his cabin doorway, watching the sky turn the color of old bruises. The wind carried a particular bite that morning, the kind that warned of something worse coming. He'd felt weather like this before, back in '69 when the blizzard buried half the territory and didn't let up for 3 weeks straight. Folks had starved that winter. Others froze in their beds. Silas had survived by knowing when to hunker down and when to move. The cabin sat nestled in a grove of pines about 8 miles up from Ironwood Creek, far enough that most people forgot he existed. That's how he preferred it. The structure was solid. He'd built it himself with logs he'd hauled and chinked, a stone fireplace that drew clean, and a roof that didn't leak even in the worst storms. Inside, everything had its place. His rifle hung above the door. His bedroll stayed neat in the corner. The shelves held preserved food, ammunition, and a few books he'd read so many times the pages fell open to his favorite passages. On the mantel above the fireplace, between a tin cup and an old compass, sat a small wooden cross no bigger than his palm. He'd carved it himself 10 years back, working the knife through pine with hands that shook from grief. The wood had darkened with age and smoke, but he never moved it. Never dusted it, either. Just left it there as a reminder of what he'd lost and why he'd chosen this lonely mountain over the company of people who asked, too. Many questions. Silas was 43 years old that winter, though his face carried more years than that. The sun and wind had weathered his skin like old leather. His beard, once dark as coal, had gone mostly gray. His eyes were pale blue, the kind that seemed to look through things rather than at them. He stood tall, just over 6 feet, with the broad shoulders and thick arms of a man who'd spent his life working with his hands. There was a scar along his left cheek, a souvenir from a Comanche lance that had come too close during his cavalry days. Those days felt like another lifetime now. He'd been a scout for the Army, one of the best according to his commanding officer. He could track a single rider across 50 miles of hard ground, could smell water from a mile off, and could move through enemy territory like smoke. They'd called him Silent Ward because he never wasted words and could go days without speaking if the mission required it. He'd been good at what he did, maybe too good. The things he'd seen, the things he'd done, they sat heavy in his chest even now. But that life had ended the day he came home to find his wife, Sarah, and his daughter Rebecca dead. He'd been away on patrol, chasing raiders who'd hit a settlement near Fort Collins. When he returned 3 days later than planned, he found his cabin burned, his family buried by neighbors who couldn't meet his eyes. Cheyenne war party, they told him. Part of the conflicts that kept flaring up across the territory. Wrong place, wrong time. Nothing personal. Nothing personal. As if that made it hurt less, Silas had left the Army the next day. Took his discharge pay, bought supplies, and headed up into these mountains where the ghosts couldn't follow quite so close. Or so he'd thought. Truth was, they followed him everywhere. He saw Sarah in the way firelight danced on the cabin walls. Heard Rebecca's laugh in the wind through the pines. Some nights he'd wake reaching for a rifle, certain he heard riders approaching, ready to defend what he'd already lost. The town of Ironwood Creek tolerated him because he didn't cause trouble, and because, twice now, he tracked down wolves that had been killing livestock. He came down once a month for supplies, spoke to almost no one except old Ben, who ran the general store, and left before anyone could strike up a conversation. The locals had their stories about him, of course. Some said he'd killed a dozen men in the war. Others claimed he'd gone half mad from isolation. A few whispered he was part Indian himself, though that was just foolishness born from the fact that he knew how to live off the land better than most thought old. Ben was the closest thing Silas had to a friend, and even that was stretching the definition. Ben was 70 if he was a day, with a shock of white hair and hands gnarled from arthritis. He'd been a trapper in his youth, knew the mountains as well as anyone, and had the good sense not to pry into other people's business. Their conversations usually centered on the price of flour, the quality of tobacco, and whether the winter would be mild or harsh. "Gonna be a hard one," Ben had told him during his last visit 2 weeks prior. "Animals are growing thick coats. Birds already headed south. My knee's aching something fierce, and it ain't never wrong." Silas had nodded, bought extra ammunition and coffee, and headed back up the mountain. He always listened when old-timers talked about weather. They'd earned their opinions through decades of watching the sky and surviving what it threw at them. Now, standing in his doorway with that bruised sky overhead, Silas knew Ben had been right. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees since yesterday. The wind had shifted to come straight from the north, carrying moisture that would turn to snow before nightfall. He could smell it in the air, that peculiar metallic scent that preceded a real storm. This wouldn't be one of those light dustings that melted by noon. This would be the kind of blizzard that buried the world in white and didn't let go for days. He spent that morning making preparations, brought in extra firewood, and stacked it against the inner wall where it would stay dry. Checked his food stores, venison he'd smoked, beans and rice in sealed containers, flour, salt, and the last of his coffee. Enough to last him through a month if needed. Filled every container he had with water from the creek before it froze solid. Secured the shutters on his windows. Made sure his rifle was cleaned and loaded. More out of habit than necessity. By afternoon, the first flakes began to fall. Large and lazy at first, drifting down through the pines like bits of torn paper. Within an hour, they came faster, smaller, driven by wind that howled through the trees. Silas watched from his window as the world disappeared behind a curtain of white. The temperature inside the cabin dropped despite the fire, and he knew this was just the beginning. He settled in for the long haul. Made himself a pot of stew with venison and wild onions. Ate slowly, savoring each bite the way a man does when he's got nothing but time. Afterward, he sat by the fire with one of his books, a collection of poems by Whitman that Sarah had loved, but couldn't focus on the words. Something felt off, though he couldn't put his finger on what. Just a tension in his chest, a restlessness he couldn't shake. Outside, the storm raged into the night. Snow piled against the cabin walls. The wind found every tiny gap in the chinking and whistled through like spirits trying to get in. Silas lay in his bedroll listening to it, remembering other storms. Other nights when the cold had been an enemy as real as any man with a gun. He didn't sleep well, never did when the weather turned, and when he finally dozed off near dawn, he dreamed of Sarah wrapped in a fur cloak, calling to him from somewhere in the snow. He woke with her name on his lips and the certainty that something was about to change, though he had no way of knowing what or how. The storm would last 3 more days. And on the 3rd day, when it finally broke enough for a man to travel, Silas would make the decision to ride down to Ironwood Creek for supplies he didn't really need. He'd tell himself it was practical thinking, restocking before the next storm hit. But somewhere deeper, in a place he didn't like to examine too closely, he knew it was something else. It was the dream. It was Sarah's voice in his head. It was 10 years of isolation finally weighing too heavy that it was fate, preparing to throw him into the path of a young woman dying in the snow, and asking him one simple question: could a man who'd lost everything find the courage to save someone else, even if it meant opening up all those old wounds again? He didn't know it yet, but his answer would change everything. Elise Brennan had been 16 years old when her parents died, taken by fever within days of each other during the crossing to Colorado. They'd sold everything back in Pennsylvania, their small farm, the furniture her grandmother had brought from Ireland, even her mother's wedding dress, all to chase the promise of a better life out west. Her father had heard about opportunities in the mining towns, about land that could be claimed, about fresh starts for families willing to work hard. They never made it past Denver. The fever had swept through their wagon train like wildfire, claiming a dozen souls before it burned itself out. Elise had nursed them both, watched them fade despite her prayers and the useless remedies the other travelers offered. When they finally closed their eyes for the last time, she'd been left with nothing but a battered trunk, $17, and a tarnished silver locket containing a faded photograph of her parents on their wedding day. The other families on the wagon train had offered their condolences, but little else. They had their own troubles, their own mouths to feed. The 16-year-old girl with no family and no money was a burden no one wanted to carry. So Elise had taken her trunk and her $17 and walked into Denver looking for work. She found it at the Garrison Hotel, a 2-story establishment that catered to miners, merchants, and the occasional cattle buyer passing through. Marcus Garrison, the owner, was a thick-set man in his 40s with oiled hair and cold eyes that lingered too long when he looked at young women. But he offered her room and board plus $2 a week for cleaning rooms, washing linens, and serving in the dining room. It wasn't much, but it was survival. For 2 years, Elise had endured. She scrubbed floors until her hands bled. She changed bedding and emptied chamber pots. She smiled at crude comments from drunk miners and dodged wandering hands. She saved every penny she could, hiding the coins in a sock at the bottom of her trunk, dreaming of the day she'd have enough to leave and start over somewhere clean. But Marcus Garrison had other plans for her. It started small. A hand on her shoulder that lingered. Comments about how she was growing into a beautiful young woman. Gifts she didn't want. A ribbon for her hair. A bottle of perfume that came with expectations she refused to acknowledge. She tried to keep her distance, to be efficient and invisible. But Garrison was not a man who accepted rejection. 3 months ago, he'd cornered her in the storage room, told her plainly that her debt to him had grown beyond what her wages could cover. The room, the food, the opportunities he'd given her, all of it came at a price. He could forgive that debt, he said, if she'd be reasonable. If she'd accept his affections the way a smart girl would. Elise had refused. She'd pushed past him and run to her room, barricading the door with her trunk. The next day, Garrison had docked her wages for breaking a lamp she hadn't touched. The day after, he'd accused her of stealing from a guest. Each week brought new accusations, new deductions from her pay, new evidence that she was trapped in a web she couldn't escape. Then came the night she saw the murder. It was late, past midnight, and she'd been carrying linens down the back stairs when she heard angry voices from Garrison's office. The door stood slightly ajar, and through the gap she saw Garrison and another man, a weasel-faced fellow named Pike, who did collections for Garrison's various business dealings. Between them stood an older man in dusty trail clothes, his face red with anger. "I filed that claim legal and proper," the older man was saying. "You got no right to it, Garrison." "Rights are for men with lawyers and money," Garrison replied calmly. "You got neither. Sign over the claim, take the $100, and count yourself lucky. That claim's worth 10 times that, and you know it. There's silver in that mountain." Pike moved faster than Elise would have thought possible. One moment he was standing by the desk. The next he had a knife buried in the old prospector's chest. The man made a wet, gasping sound and collapsed to his knees, then forward onto his face. Blood spread across the wooden floor in a dark pool. Elise had frozen, her hand pressed to her mouth to hold back the scream building in her throat. She'd watched as Pike cleaned his knife on the dead man's coat, as Garrison calmly discussed how they'd dispose of the body and forged documents showing the claim had been signed over before the unfortunate accident in the mountains. Then Garrison had looked up, his eyes meeting hers through the gap in the door. "Well now," he'd said softly, "seems we have a witness." Elise had run, dropped the linens and ran through the hotel, out the back door, into the freezing December night, wearing nothing but her work dress and a thin shawl. She'd heard Garrison shouting behind her, heard Pike's footsteps pounding after her, and she'd run harder than she'd ever run in her life. The streets of Ironwood Creek had been empty at that hour. The town shuddered against the cold and the approaching storm. She'd pounded on doors, begged for help, pleaded with anyone who might hear. But the few faces that appeared in windows took one look at her wild-eyed, frantic, and drew their curtains. No one wanted trouble with Marcus Garrison. He owned half the businesses in town, held debts on the other half, and had the marshal in his pocket. She'd tried the church. The door was locked. She'd tried the doctor's house. No answer. She'd tried the general store, the saloon, even the undertaker's. No one would open their doors. The snow had started falling then, hard and fast. The temperature dropped until her breath came out in clouds and her fingers went numb. She could hear Pike and Garrison searching for her, their voices carrying through the empty streets. They weren't hurrying. They knew she had nowhere to go. Elise had stumbled into an alley behind the church and collapsed against the wall. Her strength was gone. Her hope was gone. She huddled there, shivering, as snow began to cover her like a burial shroud. She thought about her parents, about how she'd be joining them soon. Maybe that was for the best. Maybe she'd fought long enough. She didn't know how long she'd been there when she heard the footsteps, different from the others, quieter, more purposeful. She'd looked up through snow-crusted eyelashes to see a tall figure standing over her. Not Garrison. Not Pike. Someone else. The man wore a heavy coat and a fur cloak that made him look like something from an old story. His face was weathered and bearded, his eyes pale in the lamplight from the church window. He studied her for a long moment, and she saw something in his expression that looked like recognition. Not of her, but of something she represented. He knelt down beside her, and she tried to speak, to warn him about Garrison, to explain, but her lips wouldn't work properly. The cold had gone too deep. "Please," she managed to whisper. "Help me." The man didn't answer immediately. He looked back down the alley toward where voices still called out, searching. Then he looked at her again, and something shifted in his face. Some decision made. He unwrapped the fur cloak from his shoulders and draped it around her trembling body. The warmth of it was immediate and overwhelming. She felt tears freeze on her cheeks. "You're mine now," he said, his voice rough from disuse, but somehow gentle. Then he gathered her in his arms as easily as if she weighed nothing and stood. Elise tried to ask where he was taking her, tried to warn him about the danger, but consciousness was slipping away. The last thing she remembered was the rhythm of his stride as he carried her through the snow, the warmth of the cloak, and the steady beating of his heart against her cheek. She didn't know his name. Didn't know if he was saving her or simply delaying the inevitable. Didn't know if she'd wake up at all. But for the first time since her parents died, someone had chosen to help her. Someone had looked at her suffering and decided it mattered. In a world that had shown her nothing but cruelty and indifference. That small act of mercy was enough to keep her heart beating through the long, dark journey up the mountain. 2 weeks passed, and the world outside remained locked in winter's grip. More storms came, though none as severe as that first one. Between them, Silas taught Elise the skills she'd need to survive in the mountains. Not because he expected her to stay. He told himself that repeatedly, but because knowledge was armor, and she'd need all the protection she could get. When she left, he showed her how to read the weather by watching the clouds and feeling the wind, how to find water under ice, how to set snares for rabbits and squirrels, how to preserve meat and identify which plants were safe to eat. She absorbed it all with the focus of someone who understood that survival was never guaranteed. "You're a good teacher," she said one afternoon as they checked the trapline he'd set up within walking distance of the cabin. She moved more confidently now. Her frostbite healed enough that she could wear the extra pair of boots he'd made from rabbit fur. "I had a good teacher myself once," he replied, thinking of the Ute medicine woman and the countless lessons Sarah had learned and passed on to him. Knowledge like this, it's meant to be shared. Keeping it to yourself is just selfishness. They'd caught 2 rabbits, and Elise helped him reset the snares without complaint, even though her fingers were clumsy in the cold. He noticed she never asked to go back inside until the work was done, never shirked a task no matter how unpleasant. She had grit, this girl, more than most men he'd known. The evenings became something he looked forward to. After dinner, they'd sit by the fire and talk. At first, he'd been the one listening while she shared stories about her childhood in Pennsylvania, about her mother's garden and her father's terrible jokes. But gradually, she drew stories out of him two-tailies from his scouting days, carefully edited to remove the worst violence. Stories about tracking and survival, about the beauty of the wild places he'd seen. One night, she asked about the carved cross on the mantel. Silas had known the question would come eventually. He'd seen her looking at it, seen the curiosity in her eyes, but he'd hoped she wouldn't ask. Talking about Sarah and Rebecca made them real again, made the loss fresh. "My wife made that," he said finally, the words coming slow. "Sarah. She was better with her hands than I ever was." "Where is she now?" "Dead. Her and our daughter both. 10 years ago." Elise went quiet, and he thought she might leave it there. But she asked, gently, what happened? So he told her about coming home to find his cabin burned, his family gone. About the neighbors who'd buried them before he returned. About the rage and grief that had driven him up into these mountains where he could hurt no one and nothing could hurt him anymore. "I'm sorry," she said when he finished. "That's a heavy burden to carry alone. Everyone carries something." "Yes, but some burdens are lighter when shared." He looked at her across the firelight. This young woman who'd survived her own losses, her own betrayals. "Is that why you keep that locket? To share the burden?" She touched it reflexively, the gesture so familiar now he hardly noticed it anymore. "My parents aren't here. It's all I have left of them. Sometimes I talk to them, tell them about my day." Probably sounds foolish. "No," he said quietly. "It doesn't sound foolish at all." They sat in comfortable silence after that, each lost in their own thoughts, but somehow together in the loss. It was the most at peace Silas had felt since before Sarah died. But peace never lasted long in the mountains. The next morning, old Ben arrived on snowshoes, laboring up the trail with a pack on his back. Silas saw him coming from a distance and felt his stomach tighten. Ben wouldn't make this trip in winter without good reason. Elise had gone inside when she saw someone approaching, instinctively hiding. Smart girl. Silas met Ben halfway down the trail. "Silas," Ben wheezed, out of breath from the climb. "Need to talk to you, private." They moved away from the cabin, and Ben pulled out a pipe, taking his time lighting it. "Finally," he said, "Garrison's been asking questions about a missing girl. Says you stole from him and he wants her back. That so? You know anything about that?" Silas met Ben's eyes steadily. "What if I did?" Ben sighed, puffing on his pipe. "Then I'd say you picked a fight with the wrong man. Garrison's got the marshal in his pocket, half the town in his debt. He's not the type to let things go. The girl was dying in the snow. Town turned its back. I know. I heard about it. Ben looked old suddenly, older than his 70 years. Ashamed to say, I heard the commotion that night and stayed inside my own self. Figured it wasn't my business. Didn't know it was a girl until the next morning. And now? Now I'm wondering if you're harboring her up here. And if you are, I'm wondering if you know what you're getting into. Silas was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, she'd tell you why she ran. Garrison says theft. What does she say? Murder. Says she saw Garrison and his man Pike kill an old prospector over a mining claim. Ben's face went pale. Jesus, Silas, if that's true, it's true. I can see it in her eyes. She saw something bad, and they tried to let her freeze rather than risk her talking. Then she can't go back, ever. They'll kill her for sure. I know. Ben studied him carefully. So what are you planning to do? Keep her safe. For how long? Forever? You thought this through? Silas looked back toward his cabin, where smoke rose from the chimney into the clear blue sky. No, but I'm not turning her over to men who'd kill her. That much I know. Ben nodded slowly. All right then. I brought supplies. Extra coffee, some flour, dried beans. Figured you might need them. He paused, then added, Garrison's hiring men. Bounty hunters from what I hear. Says the girl witnessed something valuable being stolen and he needs her back. Offering good money. How good? $200. Silas let out a low whistle. That kind of money would bring every desperate man in the territory. When? Already started. 3 men came through town yesterday asking questions. I told them I hadn't seen any girl, but they're searching systematic-like. Working their way through every homestead and cabin within 20 miles of town. They come up here. They'll find more than they bargained for. Ben put a hand on Silas's shoulder. I know you can handle yourself. But 3 against 1, maybe 4 if Garrison sends more. Those aren't good odds, even for you. I'll manage. That girl means something to you? Already? Silas thought about how the cabin felt warmer with her in it. About her laughter when he'd told a particularly bad joke. About the way she hummed while she worked, filling the silence that had been his only companion for so long. She means something, he admitted. Don't know what yet, but something. Ben nodded, understanding in his old eyes. Then you be careful. And if you need help, you send word. I may be old, but I can still shoot straight. They walked back to the cabin together, and Silas introduced Elise to old Ben properly. She was shy at first, wary of any outsider, but Ben's grandfatherly manner put her at ease. He shared news from town, carefully avoiding any mention of Garrison, and left them with the supplies and a promise to return in a few weeks' thought after he'd gone. Elise turned to Silas with worry in her eyes. He knows I'm here. Will he tell anyone? Ben? No. He's good people. But he brought news. Garrison's hiring bounty hunters. They're searching for you. The color drained from her face. Then I should leave. Go somewhere far away. I'm putting you in danger. You're not going anywhere. Silas, you don't understand. I understand just fine. His voice was firm, but not harsh. They want to kill you to cover up their crime. I'm not letting that happen. This is my mountain, my cabin. Anyone wants to get to you, they go through me first. But why? Why would you risk yourself for me? He looked at her standing there in Sarah's old dress that she'd altered to fit, wearing the boots he'd made, her hair catching the firelight. And he realized the answer was simple, even if it terrified him. Because you matter, he said. You matter to me. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning neither of them was quite ready to examine. But they were true, and they both knew it. The game had changed. This wasn't just about saving a life anymore. This was about protecting something precious. Something worth fighting for Dodd and Silas Ward. who'd spent 10 years running from anything that mattered, was finally ready to make a stand. That evening carried a different weight. They both felt it, the knowledge that danger was coming, that their borrowed time was running out. Elise moved around the cabin with nervous energy, unable to settle. Silas cleaned his rifle, checked his ammunition, preparing for what might come. "Tell me about her," Elise said suddenly. "Your wife. Not how she died, how she lived." Silas looked up from his work, surprised. No one had asked him that before. Everyone wanted to know about the tragedy, the violence, the loss. No one cared about the life that came before. "She was strong," he said after a moment. "Not just physically, though she was that too. Strong in her spirit. She could look at the hardest situation and find a way through it. Never complained, never gave up." He paused, memories flooding back. "She laughed easy. At my jokes, at herself, at the absurdity of trying to build a life out here in the wilderness. That laugh had made everything worthwhile. She sounds wonderful." She was. He set down the rifle and stared into the fire. "Met her in Kansas. I was stationed at Fort Riley, and she was teaching at the post school. I couldn't read much back then, grew up rough, never had proper schooling. She offered to teach me, and I agreed because I wanted to be near her." "Did she teach you?" "Taught me to read, to write, to see the world as something more than just survival and duty. She saw potential in me I didn't know existed." He smiled slightly, the first real smile Elise had seen from him. "Took her 6 months to agree to marry me. Said I was too serious, too closed off. She was right, of course. But she saw something in me worth waiting for." "And your daughter?" The smile faded, replaced by something tender and painful. "Rebecca. She was 5 when they died. Looked just like her mother, same dark hair and quick mind. She used to follow me everywhere, asking questions about everything. Why is the sky blue, Papa? Where do the birds go in winter? How do you track a deer? She wanted to know how the whole world worked. You must miss them terribly. Asterisk. Every day." He was quiet for a long moment, then added, "But tonight's the first time in 10 years I've been able to talk about them without feeling like I'm bleeding out. That's because of you." Elise moved closer, settling on the floor near his chair. "How so?" "You remind me that life goes on, that there are still people worth protecting, worth caring about. I thought I was done with all that. Thought I'd used up my portion of good things, and all that was left was to get through the days until there weren't any more days to get through." He looked down at her. "But then I found you in that snow, and something woke up in me that I thought had died with them." She reached up and took his hand, her touch gentle. "I'm glad you found me. Even with everything that's happened, everything that's coming, I'm glad." They sat like that for a while, her hand in his, the fire crackling between them. Finally, Silas stood and walked to the mantel. He picked up the small wooden box that sat beside the cross, the one Elise had noticed but never asked about. He opened it carefully and pulled out a simple gold ring. "This was Sarah's wedding band," he said, holding it up to the firelight. "I carved the box myself, kept the ring safe. Couldn't bring myself to bury it with her. Felt like I was holding on to something, even if it was just metal and memory. It's beautiful. She deserved something fancier, but it was all I could afford back then. She said it was perfect because I'd chosen it for her, and that made it worth more than gold." Elise stood and moved beside him, looking at the ring. "She sounds like she understood what really matters." She did. He closed the box carefully and set it back on the mantel. When he turned to face Elise, his expression was serious. "I need to tell you something. These men, coming bounty hunters, don't play fair. They'll do whatever it takes to collect that money. If it comes to a fight, I need you to promise me something." "What?" "That you'll run, no matter what's happening, no matter how bad it looks. You get out and you run." Ben marked a trail that leads to his place. "It's hidden, but I'll show you in the morning. You follow that trail, and Ben will help you get away from here. I'm not leaving you to fight alone. Elise, no." Her voice was firm. "You didn't leave me in that snow to die alone. I'm not leaving you to fight alone. We're in this together now. Both of us or neither of us." He wanted to argue, wanted to make her see reason, but looking at the determination in her eyes, he realized she'd made her decision. And maybe, he admitted to himself, he didn't want to face what was coming alone either. "All right," he said finally. "Together then. But you do exactly what I say when the time comes. I've been in fights before. I know how they go. You trust me to know what's best. I trust you." She said it simply, with complete conviction. "I've trusted you since the moment you wrapped that cloak around me. You haven't given me any reason to stop." Something shifted in that moment. Some invisible line they'd been dancing around finally crossed. Silas reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her face, his rough fingers gentle against her skin. She leaned into the touch, her eyes closing briefly. "How did this happen?" he asked softly. 2 weeks ago, I was alone on this mountain. Now you're not," she finished. "Neither of us is." He pulled her close then, wrapping his arms around her in an embrace that was both protective and seeking protection. She fit against him perfectly, her head tucked under his chin, her arms tight around his waist. They stood like that while the fire burned low and the night deepened outside. Neither of them spoke about the fear they both felt. Neither mentioned the bounty hunters or Garrison or the violence that was coming. For this one moment, they were just two people who'd found each other in the wilderness, who'd chosen each other when the world had given them both every reason to give up. The morning would bring strategy and preparation. But tonight, they had this. And it was enough. Outside, the temperature dropped further. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled at the moon. And on the mountain, in a cabin that had known only solitude for 10 years, two people held each other against the cold and the coming storm, finding warmth not in the fire, but in each other. Old Ben returned 3 days later. But this time, he wasn't alone. He brought the territorial judge, a stern-faced man named Ezekiel Blackwood, who'd ridden 20 miles through dangerous country to hear what Ben had told him. But more importantly, he brought news that changed everything. Silas saw them coming up the trail and stepped outside with his rifle, relaxing only when he recognized Ben's distinctive shuffle walk. The judge was a surprise, though a tall man in his 60s with iron-gray hair and the bearing of someone used to authority. He moved well for his age, keeping pace with Ben despite the difficult terrain. "Silas," Ben called out when they were close enough. "Need to talk." "Got important information." Elise stayed inside while Silas met the men on the trail. Judge Blackwood extended his hand, his grip firm and direct. "Mr. Ward, Ben here tells me you're harboring a young woman who witnessed a murder. She's under my protection. Yes, I'd like to hear her story if she's willing to tell it." Silas studied the judge's face, looking for signs of deception or hidden motives. Ben wouldn't have brought him if he wasn't trustworthy, but Silas had learned long ago that trust needed to be earned, not assumed. "Why? You planning to arrest her for Garrison?" "On the contrary." Blackwood pulled a folded paper from his coat. "I'm planning to arrest Marcus Garrison, but I need her testimony to do it. And there's something else she needs to know. Something Ben discovered that changes this entire situation." They went inside, and Elise stood near the fire, nervous but composed. Ben made the introductions, and Blackwood removed his hat respectfully before addressing her. "Miss Brennan, I understand you witnessed a murder committed by Marcus Garrison and his associate, a man named Pike?" Elise nodded slowly. "I saw Pike stab an old prospector. Garrison was there too. They were arguing about a mining claim. Can you describe the prospector? What did he look like?" "He was old, maybe 60 or 70. Had a long gray beard and wore dusty trail clothes. He was angry, saying the claim was his by legal right. Blackwood exchanged a glance with Ben. The man's name was Joseph Brennan. Does that name mean anything to you? The color drained from Elise's face. Brennan is my father's name, but he died years ago in Denver from fever. Your parents died from fever. Yes, Blackwood interrupted gently. But your father had a brother. Your uncle, Joseph Brennan. He came west to search for gold about 5 years ago. Last anyone in Pennsylvania heard from him, he was in Colorado territory. Elise's hand went to her locket, gripping it tight. I have an uncle? I didn't know my parents never mentioned. According to the records I found, your father and Joseph had a falling out years before you were born. They hadn't spoken in decades. But Joseph never married, had no children. When he struck silver on a claim up near Blackhawk, he filed paperwork listing you as his sole heir. Said he wanted to make amends with his brother's family, even if his brother was gone. I don't understand. What does this mean? It means, Blackwood said carefully, that the mine garrison killed your uncle to steal. That claim belongs to you. The Silver Star mine. And according to the assay reports Joseph filed before he died, it's worth approximately $50,000. The silence that followed was absolute. Elise swayed slightly, and Silas moved quickly to steady her, guiding her to sit in his chair. She looked up at him, then at the judge, her face a mask of shock and confusion. 50,000, that's not possible. There must be a mistake. No mistake. Blackwood unfolded the paper he'd brought. This is Joseph's will, filed with the Territorial Land Office 6 months ago. Everything he had goes to his niece, Elise Margaret Brennan, daughter of his late brother Thomas. That's you, isn't it? Yes, but I'm nobody. I clean hotel rooms. I have $17 to my name. How can I own a silver mine? Ben spoke up then, his voice kind. Because your uncle wanted you to have it, girl. Wanted to give you the life your parents couldn't. He came into my store a few times, asked about you specifically. Said he'd heard his brother's daughter was working at the Garrison Hotel, and he wanted to make contact. Wanted to tell you about your inheritance. But then he disappeared, and we all assumed he'd moved on to another strike. Garrison killed him before he could reach out to you, Blackwood added. And then he forged documents claiming Joseph had signed over the claim before his death. I've seen the forgery's crude work, but with the marshal in his pocket, Garrison thought he'd get away with it. Silas felt something cold settle in his gut. So Elise wasn't just a witness. She's the rightful owner of the mine Garrison killed to possess. That's why he was so desperate to find her. Not just to silence her testimony, but to eliminate the legal heir. Asterisk, exactly. With her dead, and no one to challenge the forged documents, Garrison would own the Silver Star outright. $50,000 in silver, maybe more as they dig deeper. Blackwood looked at Elise seriously. Miss Brennan, you're not just a witness to murder. You're the primary obstacle to one of the largest thefts in territorial history. Garrison won't stop until you're dead, or he is. Elise's hands were shaking. I don't want the mine. He can have it. I just want to be left alone, to be safe. It doesn't work that way, Silas said quietly. Even if you signed it over, he'd still kill you. You're the only one who saw the murder. Your testimony would hang both him and Pike. The money's just one more reason for him to want you dead. Then what do I do? Blackwood leaned forward. You testify. I've brought a federal marshal with me. He's waiting in town. With your testimony, we can arrest Garrison, Pike, and the corrupt town marshal. We can bring them all to trial. Justice for your uncle, safety for you, and the mine that's rightfully yours. But Garrison has hired bounty hunters. They're already searching for me. Which is why, Ben interjected, we need to act fast. Judge Blackwood has a plan. The judge nodded. I'll return to town and publicly announce that I'm investigating Joseph Brennan's disappearance. That will force Garrison's hand. He'll either have to run or try to eliminate the threat immediately. Meanwhile, The federal marshal will have men positioned to protect you and arrest anyone who comes after you. We use you as bait, but controlled bait. Safe. Safe like I was safe in Ironwood Creek? Elise's voice was bitter. They let me freeze in the street. I know. Blackwood's voice was gentle but firm. And I'm sorry for that. But this is different. This is federal authority, not local corruption. And you won't be alone. Mr. Ward here has already proven he's willing to protect you. We'll have additional men, weapons, preparation. But I won't lie to you, there's risk. Garrison is desperate, and desperate men are dangerous. Silas looked down at Elise, saw the fear and confusion warring in her expression. What do you want to do? She was quiet for a long moment, her hand still clutching the locket. Then she straightened, and he saw steel enter her spine. My uncle died because of his mine, because Garrison wanted what wasn't his. If I run now, if I let them get away with it, then my uncle died for nothing. And I'll spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder, wondering when they'll find me. So you'll testify? Yes, but on one condition. She looked at Judge Blackwood. Silas stays with me. Whatever your plan is, wherever you want me to go, he comes with me. I trust him with my life. I don't trust anyone else. Blackwood glanced at Silas. Mr. Ward, are you willing? Silas thought about the quiet life he'd had before Elise arrived. The solitude, the simplicity, the safety of caring for nothing and no one. He thought about Sarah and Rebecca, about how much it had hurt to lose them, about how opening himself up to caring again meant opening himself up to that same potential for loss. Then he looked at Elise, at the courage in her eyes despite the fear, at the determination to face her enemies rather than run. And he knew his answer had been decided the moment he wrapped his cloak around her in that frozen alley. I'm willing, but understand this. Judge, if your plan puts her at unnecessary risk, if anyone gets past your federal marshals, I'll handle things my own way. And my way isn't pretty or legal. Noted. And frankly, Mr. Ward, I'm counting on that. Blackwood stood and replaced his hat. We have 3 days before Garrison's bounty hunters reach this area. That gives us time to prepare, to set our trap. But after that, we move. Are we agreed? Elise stood and offered her hand. Agreed. They shook, sealing a bargain that would either bring justice or get them all killed. Ben and the judge left soon after, promising to return with the federal marshal and a concrete plan. After they'd gone, Elise turned to Silas. $50,000. I can't even imagine that much money. It's a fortune. If we survive this, if we actually win, what would you do with money like that? Silas looked around his simple cabin, at the life he'd built from loss and isolation. I don't know. Never thought I'd have reason to think about it. Think about it now. He met her eyes, saw the question beneath the question. What comes after? What do we become if we survive this? I guess, he said slowly, I want to build something. Not just for me. Something that matters. Like what? Like a home. A real one, not just a place to hide from the world. A place where people belong. He paused, then added quietly, where we belong. The word we hung in the air between them, full of possibility and promise. Elise stepped closer, reaching up to touch his face. Then we better make sure we survive this, she said. Because I'd like to see that home you build. We build, he corrected. We build it together. Outside, the sun set behind the mountains, painting the snow in shades of gold and crimson. 3 days until the bounty hunters arrived. 3 days to prepare for the fight that would determine not just their survival, but their future. And for the first time in 10 years, Silas Ward had something worth fighting for beyond mere survival. He had purpose. He had someone who mattered. He had hope. The federal marshal arrived the next morning with 2 deputies and a plan that made Silas's jaw tighten with worry. Marshal Tom Bridger was a career lawman in his early 50s, with a weathered face and eyes that had seen too much violence. He spread a hand-drawn map on Silas's table and outlined his strategy with military precision. Garrison knows the cabin's location by now. His bounty hunters have been asking questions all over the territory. We're going to use that knowledge against him. Bridger tapped the map. 3 bounty hunters are confirmed heading this way. Cutter, Johnson, and a half-breed tracker called Walks Quiet. All dangerous men with confirmed kills to their names. They'll arrive within 2 days. And your plan? Silas asked, studying the map carefully. We let them come. Set up positions in the trees around the cabin. Wait for them to make their move. When they show themselves, we take them into custody. Once we have them, we can offer them a deal, testify against Garrison in exchange for lighter sentences. Even hardened bounty hunters will talk when facing the noose. You're using Elise as bait. Protected bait. We'll have 6 guns covering the cabin, including yours. Nothing gets through. Elise spoke up from her position by the fire. And if something does get through? If one of them gets inside, Bridger looked at her honestly. Then you shoot them. Mr. Ward tells me he's been teaching you. You know how to handle a rifle? I'm learning. Then you'll keep learning. Because the worst mistake we could make is underestimating these men. They're being paid $200 to bring you back alive or dead. That kind of money makes men take risks. Over the next 2 days, Silas's cabin became an armed camp. The 2 deputies, both young but competent men named Carson and Webb, dug positions in the tree line, with clear sight lines to the cabin. Bridger scouted the surrounding area, identifying likely approach routes and setting subtle markers that would tell them if anyone passed. Old Ben arrived with extra ammunition and food supplies, enough to withstand a siege if necessary. Silas spent hours with Elise, drilling her on everything she'd need to know. How to load and fire the rifle quickly. How to reload under pressure. Where to position herself in the cabin for the best defensive advantage. How to tell friend from foe in the chaos of gunfire. You're scaring me, she admitted during a break in training. They stood outside the cabin, and her breath came out in white clouds in the frozen air. Good. Fear keeps you sharp, keeps you alive. The moment you stop being scared is the moment you make mistakes. He checked her grip on the rifle, adjusting her hand slightly. But don't let the fear control you. Feel it, acknowledge it, then set it aside and do what needs doing. Is that what you did in your cavalry days? Every time. Every fight, every patrol into hostile territory, I was scared. Any man who says different is either a liar or a fool. The trick is using that fear as fuel. She lowered the rifle and looked at him seriously. I don't want you to die for me. Then we'll both make sure neither of us dies. He touched her face gently. We're in this together, remember? Both of us or neither of us. That night, their last before the bounty hunters were expected to arrive. They sat together by the fire long after everyone else had bedded down. The deputies slept in the barn Silas had built for his horse. Bridger and Ben took positions outside, keeping watch in rotating shifts. Tell me something, Elise said quietly. Something good. Something that has nothing to do with guns or danger or men trying to kill me. Silas thought for a moment. When I was a boy, maybe 7 or 8, my mother used to take me down to the creek near our farm. This was back in Missouri, before the war. She'd teach me to catch crawdads with my bare hands, showed me how to move slow and patient so they wouldn't see me coming. We'd spend whole afternoons there, just the 2 of us, talking about everything and nothing. Sounds peaceful. It was. My father was a hard man, believed boys needed toughness beaten into them. But my mother knew there was strength in gentleness too, in patience and observation. Those lessons she taught me by that creek, they kept me alive more times than I can count. Knowing when to move slow, when to wait, when to strike. He paused. She died when I was 12. Fever, same as your parents. After that, there was only my father's kind of lessons. Asterisk, I'm sorry. Seems like we've both lost more than our share. Maybe that's why we found each other. Universe balancing the scales, giving us a chance at something better. She leaned against him, and he wrapped his arm around her shoulders. What will you do after this is over, assuming we survive? I've been thinking about that. The cabin's been good to me, but it's also been a hiding place. Maybe it's time to stop hiding. And do what? Build that home we talked about. Maybe closer to town, but not too close. Somewhere we can have a real life. Maybe help other folks who need it, the way Ben and the judge helped us. We could start a proper homestead. Plant crops, raise animals, maybe even adopt children who need families. She looked up at him. Would you want that? After Rebecca died because I wasn't there to protect her, but I can't let that fear stop me from living. Sarah wouldn't have wanted that. She'd have wanted me to keep going, to find joy again, to build something good out of the grief. He kissed the top of Elise's head gently. And yes, I'd want children. With you. A whole house full of them if you're willing. I'm willing. Her voice was soft but certain. I'm willing to build that life with you, Silas Ward, soon as we get through this mess. Then that's what we'll do. He pulled out something from his pocket, a simple ring he'd been crafting in secret over the past few days. It was rough work, made from a silver coin he'd melted down and shaped with his knife and a stone. Not fancy, but honest. Elise Brennan, I know this isn't the right time or place. I know we're facing a fight that could end badly, but I also know I don't want to waste another moment. Will you marry me? Tears spilled down her cheeks as she looked at the ring, then at him. You're crazy. We might die tomorrow. Is that a yes or a no? It's a yes, you impossible man. Yes, I'll marry you. He slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, and kissed her, not with desperate passion, but with gentle promise. A kiss that said, we'll survive this, and we'll build that life. And you're mine, and I'm yours, whatever comes. When they finally pulled apart, both were crying, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming rightness of the moment. Two broken people who'd found each other in the worst circumstances, choosing hope over fear, choosing love over survival. I wish we had time for a proper wedding, Elise said, admiring the ring on her finger. We'll have one, after, with Ben officiating and half the territory invited. But this right here, right now, this is what matters. You and me making a promise to each other. To love and protect. To build and create. To face whatever comes. Together. Together. He agreed. Marshal Bridger appeared in the doorway then, his face grim. Silas, got movement on the East Ridge. Walk's quiet's been spotted. They're coming tonight instead of tomorrow. The moment shattered. Silas was on his feet instantly, checking his rifle, his mind shifting from husband-to-be back to warrior. How many? 3 confirmed, but there might be more hanging back. They're being cautious, scouting the approach. Smart. They know it could be a trap. Carson and Webb are in position. I'll take the north side. Ben's got the south. You stay in the cabin with the girl. With my fiancée, Silas corrected firmly, and I'll be wherever I'm needed most. Bridger's eyebrows rose at fiancée, but he didn't comment on it. All right. Then you take the window position with the best field of fire. Keep her safe. Keep yourself alive. When this is over, I want to attend that wedding. The next hour passed in tense preparation. Every lamp in the cabin was extinguished except one, positioned to create shadows that would make it hard to see inside from outside. Elise took her position behind an overturned table near the back wall, rifle loaded and ready. Silas crouched by the window, using a small gap in the shutters to watch the tree line. The moon was 3/4 full, casting silver light across the snow. Beautiful and treacherous, bright enough to see movement, but creating shadows where men could hide. Silas's breathing slowed. his mind settling into the calm focus that had kept him alive through countless dangerous situations. Somewhere out there, 3 men were moving through the forest, intent on taking Elise back to garrison. They were professionals, killers who'd done this kind of work before. They'd be expecting resistance, would be ready for a fight, but they didn't know who they were dealing with. They didn't know about the federal marshal and his deputies. They didn't know about the trap that had been carefully laid. Most importantly, they didn't know that the quiet mountain man they'd been warned about was actually one of the deadliest scouts the cavalry had ever produced. They thought they were hunting. They had no idea they were the prey. "Silas," Elise whispered from her position. "I'm scared. I know. But remember what I taught you. Feel the fear, then set it aside. Focus on your breathing. Trust your training. And know that I won't let anything happen to you. I love you," she said simply. "I love you too. Now get ready. They're coming." He'd spotted the first movement, a shadow detaching from a tree about 50 yards out, moving with professional care from cover to cover. Walks quiet, probably, living up to his name. Where was he? The other 2 would be close. Silas raised his rifle slowly, not breaking the shadow of the window. His heart rate didn't increase. His hands didn't shake. This was what he'd been trained for, what he'd done countless times before. The only difference was the stakes. This time, he was fighting for more than just survival. He was fighting for his future. The shadow moved closer. Any moment now, Marshal Bridger would give the signal to take them alive. Any moment now, this would either end in capture and justice, or in violence and blood. Silas Ward was ready for either. Outside, a night bird called Bridger's signal. The trap was sprung and all hell broke loose. Johnson's moment of greed was all the opening Silas needed. As the bounty hunter's attention shifted toward Elise, his grip on Webb loosened fractionally just enough. Silas didn't shout a warning, didn't telegraph his move. He simply fired. The bullet took Johnson in the shoulder, spinning him away from Webb. The deputy dropped like a stone, rolled, and scrambled for cover. In the same instant, Marshal Bridges' rifle cracked from his position, the shot catching Johnson in the leg. The big man went down hard, his gun flying from his hand into the snow. But the fight wasn't over. Cutter had used the distraction to reach the cabin. He came through the door in a rush, shotgun raised, eyes searching for Elise. Silas was already moving, crossing the space between them before the bounty hunter could get his bearings in the dim interior. They collided with bone-jarring force, the shotgun discharging into the ceiling and filling the cabin with deafening thunder. They went down together, grappling for control. Cutter was younger, meaner, with the desperation of a man who knew capture meant hanging. He drove a knee into Silas's ribs, reached for a knife at his belt. Silas caught the wrist, slammed it against the floor until the blade skittered away. "Should have stayed on your mountain, old man," Cutter snarled, landing a punch that split Silas's lip. Silas responded by driving his elbow into Cutter's throat, cutting off the bounty hunter's air. They rolled across the floor, overturning furniture, each fighting with the knowledge that losing meant death. Silas felt his age, the 43 years that made him slower than he'd been, the old injuries that screamed protest with every movement. But he also felt the decade of survival in the mountains, the strength built from endless labor, and most importantly, the fierce determination to protect the woman he loved. Cutter got his hands around Silas's throat, squeezing with thumbs positioned to crush his windpipe. Black spots danced at the edges of Silas's vision. He could hear Elise screaming his name, could hear gunfire still continuing outside. His searching hand found the knife Cutter had dropped, fingers closing around the handle. He drove the blade up into Cutter's side, not deep enough to kill, but deep enough to matter. The bounty hunter's grip loosened with a howl of pain, and Silas used the moment to reverse their positions. One punch, 2, 3 delivered with all the controlled fury of a man defending what was his. Cutter went limp, unconscious or dead. Silas didn't care which. He staggered to his feet, breathing hard, and found Elise standing with her rifle trained on Cutter's motionless form. "You all right?" he managed to ask. "I'm fine." "You're bleeding. Asterisk. I'll live." He grabbed his rifle from where it had fallen and moved back to the window. Outside, the situation had resolved itself. Johnson lay in the snow, wounded and surrounded by Carson and Bridger. Webb was on his feet, battered but alive. And Walk's quiet a shot rang out from the tree line, and Marshal Bridger dove for cover. The tracker was still out there, still dangerous. But he was alone now, his partners captured or neutralized. 1 man against 5, the math no longer worked in his favor. Walk's quiet. Bridger called out, "You're the last one standing. Surrender now, and you live to see trial." The response was another shot, this one striking dangerously close to Old Ben's position. The tracker wasn't giving up. He'd fight until they killed him, or he found a way to escape. Silas made a decision. "Cover me," he said to Elise, and before she could protest, he was out the door and moving into the trees. He knew these woods better than any bounty hunter ever could. This was his mountain, his territory, and he'd be damned if some tracker was going to threaten his people on his own land. He moved through the shadows with the stealth that had earned him his cavalry reputation. Every step was calculated, placed deliberately to avoid noise. He could see Walk's Quiet's position now. The tracker had climbed a tree, giving himself elevation and cover. Smart, but it also meant limited mobility. Silas circled wide, coming at the tree from the blind side. He could have shot the man from here, an easy shot, really. But he'd killed enough men in his life. If he could end this without more death, he would. He called out, soft but clear, "You fought well, but it's over. Come down and live, or stay up there and die. Your choice." There was a long silence. Then Walk's Quiet's voice, surprisingly young. "They'll hang me anyway. Maybe, maybe not. But I guarantee you'll die if you stay in that tree. Take your chances with a judge instead of a bullet." Another silence, longer this time. Then the sound of someone climbing down. Walk's Quiet emerged from the shadows, hands raised, rifle slung over his shoulder. He was barely 20, Silas realized. Just a kid trying to make a reputation and some money. "Smart choice," Silas said, relieving him of his weapons. "Now walk." They emerged from the tree line together, and Marshal Bridger moved forward with iron shackles. Within minutes, all 3 bounty hunters were secured, Johnson and Cutter wounded but alive. Walk's Quiet unharmed but defeated. Deputy Carson found something in Cutter's coat pocket, a letter with Garrison's seal, offering an additional $500 if Elise was killed rather than captured. Physical proof of conspiracy to murder, signed by Garrison himself. The fool had put it in writing. Marshal Bridger held up the letter in the moonlight, a grim smile on his weathered face. This just became an open and shut case. "Marcus Garrison is done." Silas barely heard him. He was already moving back toward the cabin, toward Elise. She met him at the door, and he pulled her into his arms, holding her like he'd never let go. "It's over," he said into her hair. "You're safe now. We're safe." She was crying and laughing at the same time, her hands checking him for injuries, cataloging every cut and bruise. "Don't you ever do something that foolish again, Silas Ward. Can't promise that. But I can promise I'll always come back to you." Around them, the others were seeing to the wounded, securing the prisoners, beginning the cleanup that followed violence. But for this one moment, Silas and Elise existed in their own world, holding each other under the stars, knowing they'd survived the worst and could now begin building the best. The fight was over. Their future was just beginning. Spring came to the Colorado mountains like a promise kept. The snow melted in rushing streams that carved new paths through the valleys. Wildflowers pushed through the thawing ground in riots of purple and gold. And in the clearing where Silas Ward's cabin stood, a crowd had gathered for a wedding. 6 months had passed since that violent night. 6 months filled with trials and testimonies, with justice slowly grinding its way toward truth. Marcus Garrison and Pike had both been convicted of murder and conspiracy. The corrupt town marshal had resigned in disgrace. The Silver Star mine had been legally transferred to its rightful owner, Elise Brennan, soon to be Elise Ward. She stood now in the afternoon sunlight wearing a simple white dress that had belonged to the judge's wife, altered to fit her smaller frame. Her hair was pinned up with wildflowers, and around her neck she wore her mother's locket. On her finger, the rough silver ring Silas had made gleamed alongside a proper gold band they'd purchased in Denver, but she never took off first ring, the one given in darkness before a fight they might not have survived. Silas waited for her in front of the cabin. Wearing clothes Ben had insisted on buying him, a proper suit that made him look uncomfortable but distinguished. His beard was trimmed, his hair cut, but his eyes were the same pale blue that had looked at her that first night and decided she was worth saving. Deputy Carson stood beside him as his best man, fully recovered from his injuries and proud to be part of the celebration. Old Ben had indeed been ordained as a minister years ago, back when he was trapping in the far territories. He stood before them now with a Bible in his gnarled hands and tears in his old eyes, ready to perform the ceremony that would make official what everyone already knew: these two people belonged together. "We're gathered here," Ben began, his voice carrying across the clearing to the assembled guests, "to witness the joining of two souls who found each other in the darkest of times and chose love over fear, hope over despair." The ceremony was simple and heartfelt. They spoke their vows clearly, promises made not just for good times, but forged in the knowledge of what bad times could bring. When Ben pronounced them husband and wife, Silas kissed Elise with gentle reverence, and the crowd erupted in applause. The celebration that followed was everything a frontier wedding should be. Food brought by every family in attendance. Music played on fiddles and guitars. Dancing that lasted until the stars came out. Marshal Bridger made a toast praising their courage. Judge Blackwood spoke about justice and redemption. Even Walks Quiet, who'd been given a reduced sentence in exchange for his testimony, sent a letter of congratulations from the territorial prison. As the evening wore on, Silas and Elise found themselves standing slightly apart from the celebration, looking out at the valley below. The cabin was behind them, but their eyes were on the future, on the land they'd purchased with a portion of the mine's profits, where they planned to build a real home. "You thinking about the house?" Elise asked, leaning against her husband's shoulder. "Among other things. Thinking how different this day is from what I imagined 6 months ago. How different my whole life is. Do you miss it? The quiet, the solitude?" He was quiet for a moment, considering the question honestly. "Sometimes. But I don't miss the loneliness. I don't miss believing I'd used up all my chances at happiness. You gave me something I thought I'd lost forever. Reason to wake up looking forward to the day, instead of just getting through it. You gave me something too. A home. Not just a place, but the feeling of belonging somewhere with someone. I spent 2 years at that hotel feeling like a ghost that nobody saw. You saw me, Silas. You saw me when no one else would." He turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. "I see you now, Mrs. Ward, and I'm going to keep seeing you, keep choosing you, every day for the rest of our lives. That's a long time. Not nearly long enough." They kissed as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Around them, the celebration continued, but they existed in their own moment of peace and promise. Later, after the guests had departed and the clearing was quiet again, they stood together in the cabin doorway. Tomorrow they would begin building their new home. They'd already hired workers, drawn up plans for a house large enough for the family they hoped to have. The mine continued to produce, providing wealth beyond anything either had imagined. but they decided to use it wisely to build, to help others, to create something meaningful. "One more thing," Silas said, disappearing inside the cabin briefly. He returned with the small wooden cross from the mantel, the one he'd carved 10 years ago for Sarah and Rebecca. "I want to bring this to the new house, not to live in the past, but to remember, to honor what was while we build what will be." Elise took the cross carefully, understanding the trust he was placing in her by sharing this piece of his history. "We'll make a place for it, a place of honor. Your first family will always be part of who you are, and I wouldn't want it any other way." He pulled her close. This woman who understood loss because she'd lived it, who understood the weight of the past because she carried her own. Together, they stood in the doorway of the cabin that had sheltered them through the worst, looking forward to the home they would build together. The winter of 1879 had nearly killed them both. She'd been freezing and abandoned, left to die in the snow. He'd been isolated and hollow, surviving but not truly living. But on that bitter night, when he'd wrapped his fur cloak around her trembling shoulders and spoke those 4 words, "You're mine now," he'd been making a promise neither of them fully understood yet. Not a claim of ownership, but a vow of protection. Not possession, but belonging. Not his alone, but theirs shared, equal, earned through survival and sealed with love. She'd been freezing when he found her. But from that day forward, she'd never been cold again. She belonged somewhere at last, with someone who saw her worth and chose her daily. And she was his forever, just as he was hers. 2 souls who'd found each other in the wilderness and built a love stronger than winter. Stronger than fear, stronger than anything the world could throw at them. Together, always together, both of them, or neither. And they chose both.